Well, yeah, thanks for taking time out of Saturday to come here. It's great to be here. This is actually my first time in Edinburgh, and it is quite nice. I like it. So when I was small, so I'm half Icelandic, half Irish, and my parents decided that we should live in England. So we lived in kind of halfway between Liverpool and Manchester. And whenever we would go to Iceland, we'd always have to drive up to Glasgow because that was the closest flight. So in my youth, Scotland was this place that I unfortunately had to sit in a car for many hours to get to in order to get to Iceland. So, you know, my first memories of Scotland were not entirely pleasant. But what I'm going to try and do tonight is I'm going to tell you a fairly long and fairly boring story, hopefully in a fairly short and slightly entertaining way, about the experience that we had with the Icelandic constitutional process. And I'm going to preface that with a little bit of history about how Iceland got to where it is today, and then try and put that into some perspective of, you know, my entirely erroneous view of where Scotland is, and you know, because I've been trying to follow the Scottish independence debate, and you know, I'm quite interested in independence movements in general. But on the other hand, you might have noticed that the media are not entirely working to the benefit of the Yes campaign. So all of the information I get is somewhat skewed. So, you know, but hopefully my views aren't entirely wrong on the subject. But I'm going to start with the Dog Days King. So this guy is called Jörn Jönsson, which in Icelandic we say Jörundarson. He was a Danish sailor in the early 19th century who, amongst other things, made the first map of Sydney Bay in Australia when he was there in prison. And then later he went to Portsmouth and met some English guys who were on planning a trip to Iceland. And because he spoke Danish and Iceland was a Danish colony at the time, he enlisted as their translator. So in early 1809, they get to Iceland, and on the ship, the Mary and Anne. And the first thing that happens is that the Governor-General of Iceland, who is this Danish count, basically says, no, actually, you know, Denmark is at war with Britain, so therefore, you know, we're not going to allow you to trade. And while the British ship was, you know, with this soap maker Samuel Phelps and various others, were trying to figure out what to do about this, this guy just kind of went onto the mainland and made a citizen's arrest of Count Trump. And essentially performed a coup d'etat, which lasted for the summer months of 1809. And so he's referred to in Iceland as the Dog Days King for that. Although one of the things that he intended to do was to reconstitute the Icelandic parliament and set Iceland up as an independent state. Now, this kind of led to a series of weird things where basically up until that time, people in Iceland hadn't really dared to hope that there was ever any possibility of running an independent country. And, you know, but around the 1860s, a lot of you know, Romance poets, mostly Icelandic students who had gone to Copenhagen to study, started to talk, you know, proactively about the idea of independence. And this, of course, you know, kind of steamrolled to the point where in 1884, the Danish king said, okay, fine, you can have a constitution, right? Are you happy now? And, you know, this was, you know, nicely made up as part of the 1,000-year celebration of Icelandic settlement. But, of course, people pushed on, and you know, it took a couple more decades, but in 1918, Iceland got sovereignty, which is essentially the same thing as you got with the devolved parliament, in that the parliament was reinstated in proper terms. It was given a lot of leeway around self-determination, but still, you know, had the Danish king at the top and still had to like be deferential to the Danish parliament and Danish government. So 1944, while Denmark was basically occupied by Germany and couldn't really say no. Iceland decided that they would sneak out and just declare independence. Of course, at the time, Iceland was occupied by Britain. But the current constitution of Iceland is from 1944. The 1944 constitution is actually mostly unchanged from the 1918 constitution. They mostly just removed the word king and put the word president instead. They made a couple of other little changes. Some of them were grammatical, oddly enough. But at the end of the 1944 constitution, it was stated, this constitution shall be reviewed in full no later than 1945. That was nice. They wanted to do that, but nothing happened in 1945, of course. Since 1944, there have been a total of 6 changes to the Icelandic constitution. Most of them have to do with redistricting so there are 6 electoral districts or constituencies in Iceland for the parliament. And there was a 2-tier like bicameral parliament to begin with, and that was done away with in the 1980s. And then the most significant change was 1996, when they added a human rights chapter, essentially just codifying the European Convention on Human Rights that was done pretty much all around Europe in that decade. So one of the things that happened kind of in the early 90s was, you remember Margaret Thatcher? Anybody? She had a posse in Iceland as well, and her ilk managed to rise to governance, first in the city of Reykjavik and then in the parliament. And this guy, David Oddsson, who started his career as a comedian, lawyer, comedian, mayor, prime minister, foreign minister, central bank manager, and now he's the editor of one of the largest newspapers. There's no corruption, of course. There's nothing weird about this. But he was running the show under this massive program of liberalization and deregulation and whatnot. And this was all well and good, except in the early 2000s, it kind of hit this tipping point or inflection point where suddenly, the newly privatized, formerly state banks started to be very aggressive in buying up large swaths of London and Copenhagen. And many people at that time felt like this was, finally we're getting our own back for all of the trouble they caused in the past, these damn, Danish people and these damn Brits. But there was this massive expansion, and then so by the end of 2008, people started to use that's so 2007 as a kind of a swear word of sorts. Because in 2007, we were rich, we were decadent, we were a world finance capital of sorts. In 2008, and end of that, we had people protesting austerity on the streets. Unemployment went from about 1% to about 9% over the course of about 2 months. And about 17/18 of the entire economy essentially disappeared over the course of a week. So, that wasn't very good. It was somewhat embarrassing. But, people protested. There were slogans. Some of them were quite fun. That top one, "Helvitis fucking fuck," became, it means exactly what it sounds like. It doesn't really have any political statement, but it is quite telling of the type of frustration people were feeling. And what essentially happened was that the right-wing government that had been running the show, David Oddsson had been prime minister for 16 years. And essentially that government had to step down. And a new government took over in the early days of 2009 with the Social Democrats and Left Greens running the show. And this kind of opened up a lot of options because, basically after the economy collapses, you kind of go like, okay, what do we do now? Maybe we ought to fix things. Okay, how do we fix things? And one of the big demands that came up was the idea that we should actually start writing a new constitution because the old one was just kind of not very good. It was a 19th century hand-me-down that was written for the purposes of 19th century Danish bureaucrats, and it didn't really suit the purposes of a 21st century like Western liberal democracy, right? So this is kind of a vague timeline of what's going on, and the new government was kind of perceptive to this entire argument that maybe it's time for something new. And on a completely different thread, in late 2009, a group that was called the Anthill Collective, I'll come back to this, they said, okay, we need to figure out what it means to be Icelandic now. The collapse, led us into this situation where we don't really have a direction as a society. We don't know what we want to do with ourselves. So they orchestrated that 1,500 people be randomly selected from the census and gotten together in this big sports arena for a full day of sitting around, coming up with new ideas for what Iceland should be. And, okay, 1,500 people isn't a lot, but remember, this is Iceland, right? 330,000 people, so this is about 0.1% of the population. No, 0.5%, sorry, of the population. So, it is actually quite statistically significant at that point. And what these people did, so just to explain the process a little bit, they, in the first round, so everybody was put on randomly onto tables with about 7 people on each table, one of whom had been pre-selected and trained to be a facilitator. So basically given instructions on how to make sure that one person doesn't dominate the discussion and how to kind of keep things going, but also was taught the process. In the first round, they wrote these little tickets, just one idea per ticket, just something like somebody might write democracy, and another person might write education, or whatever it was, and then they'd go several circles, show their tickets one by one, and explain what the rationale was behind it, and then they would put little stickers, so each person got a certain number of stickers as votes, and would vote on the best ideas that had come up on their table. And then there was a break, and during the break all of these little tickets were taken into the back and processed, written up and statistically aggregated, so that when people came into the next round, there were statistics up on the wall showing what the total group of 1,500 people were thinking. And then second round, it went deeper, so instead of just simple ideas, it would become more complicated ideas, like statements about specific topic areas. And then by the end of the day, they came up with a large set of statements about what the country should be like. But this wasn't about a constitution, this was a general thing. The Anthill Collective just wanted to know, what is Iceland now? But when the government decided that, okay, let's do this constitutional thing, let's build a new constitution, they decided that this process had been so useful, and it was very popular, and it was just a very good process. So they emulated it and got people together again by the same random selection from the census to go into, instead of this kind of broad nebulous question of what is Iceland now, or where should we be, or what are our values, it became, what should our constitution say? And over the course of another day, this time in October 2010, people wrote down all of this kind of stuff that became the ingredients for the new constitution. And the outcome was, kind of fairly predictable. This is kind of just a random word cloud. So Iceland, a nation above it, land is land, of course, constitution. But then you have more interesting stuff around the rims, like natural resources and education and guarantees and independence and personal voting and that kind of thing, equality. So, people were coming up with stuff that was entirely predictable in a certain way for what should be in a constitution, but there are also a lot of kind of weird, wacky ideas that people were quite in favor of, such as, freedom of media, access to information, referendums or initiative and referendum mechanisms, that kind of thing. And this was all well and good, and this got handed over to a committee who prepared the work for the Constitutional Council. Now, the Constitutional Council was intended to be a constitutional assembly, different from the 1,000-person assembly. It was supposed to be an elected 25-person group from the general public. So an election was called for. 523 candidates ran as individuals without any political parties behind them. And that's kind of crazy when you have 523 people running for 25 seats. It's a very weird dynamic that kind of came up. But the elections came and went, and then shortly after the elections, one of the candidates sued for annulment, and the Supreme Court came to the conclusion that yes, in fact, there were 6 violations of the election law. And so one of these violations was that when people got the ballot sheets, they were kind of flat, right? And people were supposed to hand them in flat because they came flat. Because the election law says that the ballot should be put into the ballot box with exactly the same fold as they had when they were received. But the Supreme Court said they didn't have a fold, therefore they were not legal ballots. Okay, that's an odd one. That doesn't sound like the intent of that particular law, but fair enough. Another one was that the law says that the ballot boxes, the kind of rooms that you go into to vote, that they should, the walls on them should go right from the ground all the way to the ceiling. And this was fine, except in some places like Reykjavik Town Hall, where the ceiling is like 6 or 7 meters high, they decided to just cut off at about 2.5 meters, assuming that nobody would be that tall. And of course, this was considered to be illegal because, of course, and entirely ignoring all the facts that all of the other elections up until that point had exactly the same format. That didn't matter. This was just a process that needed to be killed as far as the Supreme Court was concerned. So the election got annulled, which put the government in a very weird position. They had the option of just dropping the entire process, which nobody would have really liked, but except the right-wing Conservative Party that really did not want the process to go forward. Or, alternatively, they could spend another $300 million, kronas, which is a fairly substantially lower number than dollars or pounds or anything like that. I guess it's about 150, no, it's about 1.5 million pounds, right? On running another election. Only that would annoy the electorate who probably wouldn't show up that time to vote, and it would annoy the candidates who just spent all that time and effort campaigning and then only to have to do the entire thing over again. It just wouldn't be a very elegant solution. So they came up with the third option, which was, okay, let's just appoint a council, a constitutional council, and let's have 25 seats in that council, and let's appoint to the council the people who would have won if the election had been legal. It's a fairly good solution, right? So these are them. It's a fairly good crowd. And around the same time, so disclosure, I ran in that election but lost. But then again, so did 498 others. Well, strictly speaking, so did 523 others because it wasn't an election, right? But me and a friend of mine, Eleanor Saita, started this thing that we called the Constitutional Analysis Support Team. And because both Ella and I work a bit in computer security, information security, we have all these methods for doing analysis on computer software to try and figure out if there are vulnerabilities and bugs and things that could be abused by people with, with evil intent. And we said, and we were sitting in a Thai restaurant in Reykjavik, kind of eating pad Thai or something, when we came up with this idea and went like, why can't we use that for law? Why can't we use exactly the same analytical tools as we use to verify the validity of software to verify the validity of a constitution? And turns out you can. So we started doing that, and basically the Constitutional Council started writing their, if there are any linguists in the room, this is incorrect. But yeah. They started to work, and they worked for a 3-month period. And at the end of each week, they would publish their most recent draft constitution on the internet. And so the first week, they only came up with a rough structure, what chapters they wanted, more or less, and some kind of basic wording of what else they might want to put in there. But by the second week, they'd started to flesh out the human rights chapter, and then they started to work on the executive and the judiciary and so on and so forth. And every passing week, we would take the output and we'd run it through various kinds of analysis. And sometimes we found big problems, like the court of impeachment being overmanned by the parliament, and therefore the same people were doing the impeaching and the judgment on the impeaching. So we reported this back. And the Constitutional Council were accepting feedback in various forms. So we're not the only group doing this. There were groups all over society with interest in economics, in new types of currencies, in social welfare and housing, and whichever topic it was, education through to animal welfare. They were all sending in comments. And these comments were very largely sent through Facebook messages, through Twitter, the occasional YouTube video. Some people sent them email, and then just to round it all off, they also had a comments thing on a website. Plus, anybody was free to come and witness the proceedings as they were working, and kind of even weigh in private, not disturbing the process, but this meant that every week people were seeing their feedback being included into this draft document, and we could see its evolution from week to week. It was a fairly impressive process, I would say. So they finished their work at the end of July 2011, and by then, and remember, 2011 is a kind of crazy year. That's the year of the Arab Spring. That's the year when the student riots and all that in England, and it was a very powerful year of political tensions. But by October, when the Icelandic Parliament started its 140th session, it received the kind of new constitutional proposal and essentially stuck it under a chair and didn't do anything for practically a full year. They did decide in April 2012 that it would be good to have a non-binding referendum in October. Now, the reason it had to be non-binding has to do with the way the current constitution stipulates how the constitution shall be changed. Because currently you need Parliament to agree to a law which changes the constitution. And the moment such a law has been passed, Parliament is automatically dissolved and a general election is called for. The new Parliament comes in and they have to verify the same law without changes. And if that happens, then that new change to the constitution takes effect immediately. And this sounds like a fairly reasonable process in many ways. It is actually in practice a bit weird, because you would think that that would mean that the election, the general election, would be about the constitutional change, but in practice it isn't. But either way, this meant that the public could not actually vote on changing the constitution. They could only provide input. And there was, in October, a referendum. And this is the ballot sheet for that. It was 6 questions. Here they are. So, do you wish for the Constitutional Council's proposals to form the basis for a new draft constitution? Which is a bit nebulous in the wording. It doesn't say, do you want the Constitutional Council's proposal to become the constitution? That would have been more clear wording, but fair enough. And then they asked, so that's the main question, and then they asked 5 clarification questions about things that they in the Parliament had not been able to come to an acceptable conclusion about amongst themselves. So one being about the ownership of natural resources. The Constitutional Council had come to the conclusion that common ownership, just essentially the commons, were a good idea. And that, resource usage should be licensed, or at least there shouldn't be property rights over natural resources. Sounds like a reasonable idea, right? But they had to check on that one. They also, there is a national state, like a state church in Iceland, which is, not really my cup of tea, but fair enough. And they decided to ask whether people wanted to include that in the new constitution or not. Then, election of particular individuals to the Parliament. So rather than electing parties, that you elect individuals. That was something that they asked to a greater extent than is currently the case at present, which meant they weren't going to drop the party system. Of course they weren't. They're Parliament. But they were maybe open to the idea of allowing people to choose which representatives they prefer, and maybe even for people to run without parties behind them. And then provision for equal, so that all votes around the country have equal weight. This is a weird request in Iceland because of the way the election system works there. It's a proportional voting system where any leftover votes in one constituency after all of the votes have been allocated to seats, any leftover votes start to rotate clockwise around the country. So they go over to the next constituency over, and so on, allocated to the same parties until either all of the seats are allocated all around the country, or the votes are depleted, whichever happens first. It's a fairly sensible system, and it means that in practice most votes are fairly close to equal, but there is a slight differential. This isn't anywhere near as big as the differential between, say, certain parts of Sussex versus, say, the Isle of Wight, where 20,000 people versus 102,000 people behind one parliamentary seat. But they decided they wanted to make that a bit more even, and then they also wanted to ask whether people actually wanted there to be initiative and referendum mechanisms. And the proposal from the Constitutional Council actually contained 3 such provisions. One was a 10% threshold for the public to automatically enter a bill into Parliament so that it gets injected into the process without there having to be a parliamentarian sponsoring it. So just a way of actually just putting a bill on the table. The second was a 3% of the population could put a parliamentary resolution proposal into the parliamentary process. And then the last one was a 1% would be sufficient to demand that any bill gets pushed to a referendum. And that was pretty good. Especially if you notice the little hack in there, that if you have 10% supporting a bill going into Parliament, then you, by implication, have the 1% needed to push it to referendum, right? Clever. So the results from this referendum were a resounding yes, 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 yes. The closest one was one about the state church. The state church is not particularly popular in Iceland. It is a country where most people claim to be atheist, but a large number of those atheists say that the state church is kind of cuddly. You know, but then there was a spanner thrown in the works. So 2 days after the referendum, we find out that that the Parliament had asked a team of 3 lawyers to go through the proposed constitution with a fine-tooth comb and figure out if there's any problems in the legal language. They were not supposed to change the content of the constitution. They were not supposed to remove anything, they were not supposed to add anything, they were just supposed to tighten up the legal language. So this is the an example of the changes they made. You'll notice this entire paragraph here about information freedom that they removed. They also remove, you know, lots of other things. Here's another page from them where they also remove stuff. So all hell broke loose when you know, people were like, no, that's not what you're told to do. No, we're not okay with that. And most of December 2012 was kind of wasted on this weird political debate about whether the 3 lawyers who had a mandate to fix the legal terminology had more standing than the semi-quasi-elected Constitutional Council. But eventually, I think it was late January by the time people actually said, okay, fine, we'll put it back the way it was without any legal fix-ups. But we demand that it be sent to the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe, who are like this body of constitutional experts from all of the Council of Europe countries, so that's 48 countries, and get them to give the new constitution their blessing. At which point it was kind of obvious that they were just, you know, finding reasons or methods to stall until the election. But that happened, it went through, the second discussion happened, the third discussion happened, and May 2013 was when the next general election was supposed to happen. And so, pretty much the day before the Parliament was dissolved for the to go to the general election, the new leader of the Social Democrat Party, his party had been, you know, running this and kind of pushing for this at the beginning. Partially because the Prime Minister, who used to be the leader of the Social Democrats, she's a formidable woman who's really impressive, has a long history of kind of activism in the Parliament, and not always in such a way as I agreed with her, but still. She's kind of most famous for having said, you know, in a powerful tone sometime in the early 90s, "My time will come," and certainly it did. And, you know, as Prime Minister, she kind of was considering her legacy. And the entire constitutional process could be considered part of that. But the new leader of the Social Democrats, who took over when she was retired, said, well, you know, I'm not sure about this thing. No, the Conservatives are probably going to win the next election, and, you know, we don't want them to be able to kill this. We don't want them to be able to take the election on the basis of this. It's probably a safer game to play to just take it off the table and just act like it never happened. But, of course, they did throw in a new constitutional bill at the last minute. And you'll notice how the first, second and third discussions, so all parliamentary bills are required to go through 3 discussions. They're kind of nicely spaced out over the space of about a year. The new bill for changing the constitution just added one clause, which was that a 2/3 majority of the Parliament could change the constitution for the next 4 years. without the parliament having to be dissolved and go to election. And this constitutional change was not sent to the Venice Commission. There was no team of 3 lawyers appointed to look through that particular constitutional change, nor was any of the other, kind of speed bumps in the process involved, put in there. And the 3 discussions about the new constitutional proposal all happened within the space of 2 hours. So that happened, and then there were general elections, and a new conservative populist government. I'm using populist basically as a kind of nice way of saying fascist. The Progressive Party, as they call themselves, who are about as progressive as something that's not very progressive, they now have the Prime Minister's office and various other things, and they've actually been playing the racist card and actually getting a lot of support for that, and they've been doing all sorts of things that I thought would have thought 4 years ago would be absolutely impossible to do in Iceland with any measure of success. But there we are. That's where we are today. So all of this kind of comes back to a certain point of warning, right? Because you're in the middle of this very interesting process for, essentially trying to achieve more self-determination. And there are people who are out there to say, no, you should not gain more self-determination. You should not be independent. You should not get any of the freedoms that come with being independent, because we say so. And right now, the things that they're doing to stop you, and I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that most people in here are from the Yes campaign, or at least Yes side of the table. Those of you who aren't, okay, hopefully I'll help to convince you otherwise. But the people who are very strongly in favor of no are currently maybe steering the media debate a little bit, maybe putting all sorts of weird landmines in the process, such as saying that oh, you can't join the European Union if you go independent, or what currency are you going to use, or any number of other things that actually, if you go right down to it, is completely irrelevant and useless and pointless to even talk about, because every country that has gained independence ever has found a way to solve these problems. But you see what happened in Iceland, this kind of slow biting process of just putting one roadblock after another until the process could be killed. And I'm pretty sure that as you get closer to referendum day, you're going to see some very, very big roadblocks. So figuring out ways to anticipate those roadblocks might be interesting. But ultimately, this, the vast shape of democracy is a complicated beast. We go around in most countries in the world now claiming, oh yeah, we have democracy. There are countries out there like the Democratic Republic of Congo that they're neither democratic nor a particularly functional republic. And then you have the United Kingdom, that by pretty much any measure, actually, like if you just do a function by function comparison of the British government and the Iranian government, they are actually homogeneous, right? They fit into each other perfectly. Instead of the Ayatollah, you have a queen. And yeah, okay, I'm not going to belabor that particular metaphor, but there is this really salient question of what gets to be called a democracy nowadays. And we also have to ask ourselves, when we're doing a new constitution or building a new society, what could possibly go wrong? And most of the time, people will come up with all sorts of fear-driven excuses, because fear is a very good motivator to do nothing. And ultimately, the Icelandic experience has been that it is easier to go on for 4 years of arguing back and forth about stuff that doesn't actually matter, and then ultimately choose to do nothing. Because changing the way you live, changing the way your society is structured, is actually a fairly large leap. And when it comes right down to it, people will be slightly more conservative when push comes to shove. So when we were dealing with the Constitution in Iceland, there were a lot of interesting challenges. Most lawyers said they didn't like the idea of the new Constitution, which is strange to me because I would have thought they would have gotten a lot more work after, but wait, all of the laws changed overnight? What are we going to do? But they said, oh no, there's going to be so much legal uncertainty. We can't stand for that. That's going to be complicated and as if laws have never been written before. And right-wing people in Iceland, there's this kind of weird thing going back all the way back to Jón Jönsson's time or even further, where about 10 families who are typically put in on the right-wing side of Icelandic politics, the conservative right-wing as opposed to liberal right-wing, have essentially controlled the country for the last 2 or 3 centuries. But that's something that we can't really do much about. But it led to the fact that right-wing people did not want to lose the power that they were implicitly given by the failings in the structure of the old constitution. Conservative wing, okay, that's odd, typing too fast. Conservative people generally didn't like it because newfangled weird stuff. We don't want this. Yeah, the old one has worked for us for 100 years. Why do we need to change anything? And then people outside of Reykjavik. A lot of people outside of Reykjavik. Reykjavik has about, or the greater Reykjavik area has about 2/3 of the population of Iceland. And people outside of there tend to be somewhat cynical and suspicious whenever people in Reykjavik are excited about something. And for good reason, I guess. Very frequently what people in Reykjavik are excited about is stuff that's going to cause more poverty and desolation in the countryside. So people were reasonably cynical, and the government actually did zero things to try and alleviate some of those fears. And then older people, again, I think that has some relationship with conservatism. But the question is, how much of the same applies here? I kind of get the impression that at least one of these doesn't, which is, the fourth one here about, because Edinburgh is not that big in comparison to Scotland. You've got, a much kind of wider social dynamic. It isn't as if you have 2/3 of your population in one place. But apart from that, isn't this exactly the same threat model? Isn't this essentially the same kind of argumentation or same demographics of argumentation that you're going to see? So what happens in that kind of scenario? Well, in Iceland, what happened was that 67% of the population was, still in favor of it, but only because, well, who would ever stand against it, right? And of course, this is a nonsense statement, because there were lots of old people, there were lots of conservative people, there were lots of people from every walk of life who were actually quite excited about the idea of a new constitution. But the debate got entirely sidetracked and sidelined and put into a nice media spin. And ultimately, people who had lots of power and lots of vested interests got the better of us. So, vested interests. I always like the story of the Luddite uprising. It's kind of one of my favorite things, because ultimately this was another battle about self-determination. Ned Ludd being the leader of the Luddite movement, who essentially were 19th century terrorists, or at least they'd be called that now and be arrested under the Terrorism Act and be sent to somewhere. And actually this led to 2 different laws. I really like this. This is kind of the first example, or the frame-breaking act of 1806. I think is the first example of a law in kind of modern world where, or kind of recent history, where property rights were considered to be of higher value than human lives. But the reason I'm pointing at this entire Luddite angle is that the exact same thing was happening, only some of the facts were in reverse. You had this strange kind of movement trying to change things, but they ultimately owned the process and could decide whatever they wanted. And the Luddites were the guys saying, hey, wait, hang on a moment, is this actually in our best interest? And they weren't actually anti-technology, as is always said. If you actually read the writings of the Luddites, they were entirely pro-technology. They were just rather concerned about who gets to own it. Owning the process is kind of important, especially when you're building a new state or a new society. So, what is to be gained from independence then? Well, first off, societies are really messy. Societies kind of just get all sorts of crazy at all sorts of times for all sorts of reasons. And sometimes you have to go like, yeah, maybe it's better off if we just let somebody else manage this, right? It's a lot easier to have somebody in London deal with all of the complexity, isn't it? But what you gain is, so the entire European issue, we have, David Cameron asking Manuel Barroso to say some unkind words about the future prospects of Scotland, just in case anybody's listening to Manuel Barroso. And kind of about the same week as he made those statements, about Scotland probably not being able to get into the European Union, they sent a delegation from OLAF, which is the European Anti-Corruption Unit, that also does some things about guaranteeing corruption levels or measuring corruption levels prior to a session. They sent them to Ukraine. And you'd have to wonder, why is a European Union anti-corruption body operating in a country that is not part of the European Union? Well, so 2 weeks ago I was in Brussels, and I met this fairly high-level political, let's say somebody who's got all of his fingers in all of the pies. And he says, oh yeah, look, the Olaf thing, that is proof that Scotland will be let in, right? If you want to be. Because ultimately, they cannot be fast-tracking Ukraine in and then not admitting a North European state with a long history of not being corrupt, right? So, the general consensus amongst people who are in the know in Brussels appears to be that every single reason that has been manufactured for why people in Scotland should say no is actually based on falsehood. Simple as that. Now, so you can remain in the European Union. You can also get this wonderful thing of economic self-determination, which, in the worst case means that you all get reduced to peasant farmers. But at least you're peasant farmers working on your own terms then. More realistically, you have 21st century infrastructure, you have information technology, you have communications capability. Until 2007, Edinburgh was in 17th place over the world's financial centers. Of course, 2013 it was in 64th place, but things kind of fluctuate a bit, I guess, in the financial sector. You also have the fact that over the last 20 years, about £20 billion worth of unspent tax revenue collected in Scotland got sent to England to pay off whatever debts are there. So it's not as if Scotland is poor. You are actually a fairly good, strongly economically independent country. So, I'd say, the likelihood of you becoming that guy is entirely limited to how much you want to be that guy. Then there's the issue of local control of local wealth. I could talk about oil here, but just assume that I'm talking about oil when I talk about whiskey. So 80% of Scottish whiskey is owned by English and American companies, which means that about 80% of the wealth that gets generated by that goes out of Scotland. Does that sound like oil to you? Because I think it's actually worse in the oil industry. So you have an option here, and here's an interesting kind of thing where I say, welcome to Scandinavia, right? Because you could operate on the exact same terms as the Norwegian government. You can set up a sovereign wealth fund. You can, benefit directly from all of the oil sales and whatnot. And let's say that you're environmentalists. I don't know if you are, but if you were, then you'd be thinking, oh yeah, we need to stop that oil thing from happening. Well, how about you have this sovereign wealth fund and you take, say, 20, 30, 40%. You can pick any percentage you like. You can pick 52.9 if you want. Percent of the profits that go into that sovereign wealth fund, and use it to fund university research into renewable energy. I know that's a crazy idea, but you've got to start somewhere, right? The point here is that once you have local control over the local wealth, you have infinite possibilities to actually expand and build things whichever which way you like. And you can, Scotland does seem to me much closer to Scandinavia than it does to England. So, culturally, politically, etc. So if you operate on a Scandinavian model, you can probably even join some of our Nordic Council and stuff like that, because why not? And you can modernize your protocols of governance, essentially kill common law, because common law is a bit silly, and adopt civil law. I don't know, that's maybe, nah, never mind, okay. And then you might have options for democracy. That's always a big question. So, incidentally, last weekend I was there. This is the chalet at Mezihiria in Kiev, President Yanukovych's former residence. And he had basically managed to privatize a big national park into his own pocket, and then built a very big palace there that, expropriating 38 billion euros from the Ukrainian public. Does that sound familiar? Oh, no, I'm not going to make any comments on that. And then finally, you can have this option of a cultural rebirth, because, everybody loves Scotland, right? Everybody loves the Scottish. But really, as cool as the Edinburgh Festival is, and and everything like that, and Robert Louis Stevenson's kind of one of my favorite poets and authors, but really, Scottish cities are not exactly known for being the cultural hubs of the world. I'm afraid to say it. Sorry. People will go to Paris and Berlin and London, unfortunately. People even go to Reykjavik. Reykjavik is a very cool city. Everybody loves going to Reykjavik. It could be the same here, because you can create whichever culture you want. Do it whichever way you want. But at the end of the day, it is up to you guys. Should Scotland be an independent country? Right now, not looking too good. I don't know how skewed this is. I'm told it is skewed. I'm told that it's skewed in favor of yes, or in favor of no, so that in practice it'll be quite a resounding yes come September. I really hope that's right, because I kind of like this place, and I think it would be a whole lot better if it were independent. So, that's that. Thank you.
Was the process too elongated, and that first, spirit of revolution from the Protestant man's revolution really, by the time you got to 2013, really got dissipated, and you've got a right-wing government elected, maybe the answer is it should have been a little quicker, the process,
Absolutely. I fully agree with that. And actually, so one is just make it quicker to capture the moment, but also not allowing people to have time to come up with creative ways of slowing things down. Because for every slowdown that happened, 2 more slowdowns showed up. So, yeah, I don't know, is the referendum in September binding?
Well.
See, that sounds like potential for roadblocks right there.
It's fine. The Edinburgh Agreement says both sides will accept themselves, but you will find there'll be lots of obstacles placed and there'll be lots of tough negotiations. But I think once Scotland has voted, if it does vote for independence, then the process will continue, but there'll be battles.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
All right, thanks. Could I ask, the process of consultation and the national assemblies that you had and the involvement of 0.5% of your entire population, to what extent did that excite and energize people, or maybe even radicalize them, the process of actually having that discussion? And now that you've went through all of that to end up with in your own words, a conservative fascist government, what's the legacy of that? Have people just gone away, or has something fundamentally changed beneath the surface that needs to regroup and come back? Because I think here in Scotland we need to think about that too, because one of the great things about the debate we've had in the last couple of years is that the genie is out of the bottle now. A lot of people who never thought about it before are excited about the prospect of becoming a progressive independent country and doing things here and in the world. And no matter what the outcome on September the 18th, that isn't going to go away.
Right.
So I'm just wondering, what's the legacy of that process in Iceland?
So a lot of people kind of experienced a certain political awakening around the pots and pans revolution. I mean, prior to that, people didn't really protest in Iceland. That just didn't really happen. It had happened once before in any significant fashion in 1949, when Iceland was one of the founding members of NATO. And this was decided by the parliament at the time, and the public was very much against this idea. There were massive protests, and it was the first of 2 times when tear gas has been used in Iceland. The second was during the pots and pans revolution, just before the government resigned. So, a lot of people kind of came of age in a certain sense politically during that era, and that's not going to go away for everybody. But at the same time, I do feel like the length of the process and how hard it was to kind of through all of the hoops and how it kind of got captured by the bureaucrats meant that that a lot of people just kind of got tired and dogged and, in many cases burned out. Many of my, good activist friends in Iceland who have been fighting, for years and years and years for systemic change are now just at the end of their rope. They're just can't fight anymore. And I hope they will regain the ability to do so because, 3 years from now, there's another general election, and we have the ability to take that constitution that was written and put it back on the agenda and actually get it through this time. Because, as you say, the genie is out of the bottle. But, the question is, how many genies are there, and what are people wishing for? It's not necessary that, even if it's like 10-20% of the population suddenly realize that they have power, that's not really useful unless we have a total aggregate of more than 50%, right? So it's going to take some time.
Can we take, Peter, do you have a question and a gentleman there? Can we take the 2 questions together and we'll...
Yeah. An almost forgotten writer, American longshoreman Eric Hoffer, wrote a book in the 50s called The True Believer. and it was an analysis of the genesis and the development of mass movements. And we certainly have a mass movement in Scotland, one that we've never had anything like it before, arguably. But Eric Hoffer makes a point, and it's a chilling point, that mass movements go through the phase of the men of words and the women of words, the complex analysis, the arguments, the focus on constitutions. But there comes a point when the people of action have to appear, that are not advocating going to the streets and burning flags, but we have 95 days to go. The time for complex social analysis, I'm not saying it's past, but I think it has to be put on the shelf. We have to be concentrating on the core essence of the arguments if we're to have any chance at all. In a sense, we're down to what Eric Hoffer modelled his book on, which was the Essays of Montaigne. And there were a series of aphorisms, of simple statements of belief. And these are not yet, in my humble view, strong enough, clearly delineated enough to carry us through. But there has to be anything in the Icelandic experience that mirrors that.
I think so. I think the main takeaway of what I've been trying to say is that, is kind of in the form of a warning that at some point somebody is going to try and take over the process, and they're going to try and change the debate. And while there is a time for words and there's a time for action, it would be an absolute pity if all the action is wasted in the wrong place when push comes to shove, because there wasn't the right type of analysis going on. But in Iceland so far, there haven't been many people of action stepping forward. There are people who have kind of gained prominence in the political scene and are making fairly big statements, but ultimately they haven't been capable of steering this thing in any direction which the population would like to go. So I don't know if you want the strongman to appear or the benevolent dictator. I certainly am not a fan of that model. But but when you ask for heroes, that's often what you get. And I'd rather have an entire population of heroes than just a handful emerging at the right moment, or the wrong moment, as it often is. Right.
Well, I was going to say two things. First of all, we've been very lucky with our lawyers in Scotland. Tony Blair didn't really ever want us to get the first Parliament, and when they sent a real watch bill, and luckily we had Donald Dewar and Wendy Alexander, who were both lawyers, and within a couple of days they had actually straightened up, and it was ready to discuss within about a week. So I actually think you're very, very lucky in this country that our lawyers are right there with us.
Yeah.
But as far as crowdsourcing the Constitution goes, we will probably have to do that from scratch. It's not going to be 6 questions on what do we do to get back on the feet again. And I think that's where we would probably, we'll probably have to start from, there is no UK Constitution.
Right.
So something that makes sense and how we would actually crowdsource ideas and mechanisms that would make sense. Have you any ideas about that?
Well, so the National Assembly process where 1,500 people randomly selected from the census is possibly a good starting point. I mean, it wasn't just 6 questions there. It was a whole tome. It was a multi-volume book of statements and ideas and statistics mostly that came out of that process, and it took one day. Now, 1,500 people are not going to be statistically significant here in Scotland. You've got 5 million people, so how about saying 50,000, right? 50,000 sounds like a good number. It's an entirely arbitrary number that I just pulled out of my, but pick a number and try to split it up geographically in such a way that you gather people together in sports arenas scattered around the country, in some way proportionately, and then run a process similar to that one. Gather those statistics, get those ideas down, and use the fact that we have, this crazy idea called the internet. Have you heard of it? It's really awesome. I really like the internet. Connect all of those sports arenas together, get all of the data analysis while it's happening, fed into the same thing, and heck, televise it as well. Make it into a national event bigger than the World Cup, because it can be, right? And that's the starting point. And one of the beautiful things that you have here that we did not have in Iceland was that you don't have, there is no written constitution of the UK. It's an absolute shame, because it means that you have to be a lawyer in order to know all of the massive sort of constitutional law. But, this means that you have a clean slate, so you can't have people saying, oh yeah, we don't have a constitution, oh no, we have a perfectly good constitution, because that was one of the death knells for our process. So,
After this event, there's an event downstairs, which is the launch of our new paper, Closer. And in this, there's a specific proposal about that process, very similar to what Smari's described, that has been developed by a group of thinkers and writers to look at how we could do that here. So if you'd like to join us downstairs in 15 minutes when we finish this in the cafe, you'd be very welcome, and pick up a copy. I'm going to have to go and set up.
Oh, right. Okay.
So I'm going to leave you. Lee, do you want to?
Yeah. Actually, just incidentally, as a weird historical side note, that process that I just described is actually it's actually described, the first or oldest instance I've been able to find that kind of process being described was in the so-called Green Book by Gaddafi, former president of Libya, who was quite an idealistic man in his youth. I don't know how it lasted through his older age. So, I don't think we should count that against it, that he should come up with that as well. But we might want to beware not to fall into the pitfalls he did. Yeah.
Most of the attention around is quite promotional. What's to prevent people wanting to ram everyday political contestation of the government of the day into a constitution? Because you're celebrating the state and the constitution.
Yeah.
How do you limit the power of the constitution so that it isn't anti-political?
Right. So it's a very important point you raise. When you're writing a constitution, you want it to be timeless, because one of the worst things that can happen is that 10, 20, 30 years, or even 300 years down the road, changes in the social structure, changes in society have come to the point where, suddenly your constitution is actually standing in the way of progress. This is something I think the United States are running into now with their electoral college, right? That simply the electoral college combined with big business and all of that is leading to a process where it's impossible for anybody to actually become politically active unless they were born into the correct dynasty. But how do you guarantee timelessness? I don't know. I think ultimately it comes down to when you're in the process of writing it, you make sure that everybody has that question raised for them every now and then. That you're just having a certain mindfulness, because I don't know, if this was something that we'd actually run into in the Icelandic process, I might have a better answer for you. But the truth is that maybe out of sheer luck or happenstance, or maybe as a side effect of how the Constitutional Council was selected, the people who were there were very mindful of not being caught into the political madness of the day or anything like that. And the biggest accusation from the right wing in the newspapers was that the constitutional process was a reactionary document. Was producing a reactionary document. And I guess that just that assertion or that accusation was in a certain way a certain push against, to make sure that didn't happen. But it's hard.
Yeah. There's a bit of irony here that the British government have written over 50 constitutions for other countries since the Second World War.
Yes.
And also that you said 50,000 people. If you count all of the members of political parties in Scotland, it only measures just over 50,000. So if you get 50,000 and one, you've got more members than they have. You can speak with more authority.
Okay. Well, I mean, that might be a good reason to pick a number like 100,000. You got to have moral authority, right? But yeah, the British are incredibly good at writing constitutions. It's a shame they haven't done it for themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that's never been discussed in the independence debate so far is the nature of the relationship of the Constitution towards the head of state. I love this. I like the fact it's not been discussed yet, because the constitutional process will come after a yes vote. And in that constitutional process, you'll have to decide, because the draft constitutions have already said it would be Her Majesty's lineage.
Right.
That's when we make our move for a republic. And I like the fact I like the fact that it's not discussed at this. Many of us are Republicans and that, but that's when we'll make a move for a republic. After a yes vote, we're going for a constitution. Just in case you want. That would arise inevitably anyway in the discussions of a constitution.
But even within the scope of continuation of the monarchic rule, Canada has a constitution, New Zealand has a constitution, Australia has one. You know, that is a problem that has been solved. So essentially, you know, every argument that has been made against Scottish independence is nonsense. You know, just you should probably make a list of all of the arguments. There aren't that many, and then just, you know, write a 3-word refutation. You are wrong might be a good start, but yeah. Anything else?
One more briefly, if I may. From your observation of Scottish politics, would you say that the question of the Scottish Constitution will have any life whatsoever after a no vote?
Oh, that's a hard one. I guess it depends on the margins. But it would be very interesting. So as much as I hope that you don't have a no, that if there were a no, then that people say, well, okay, we can't have independence, but can we please have a constitution? That would be, and that might even strengthen the position of the Scottish Parliament and kind of the separation. I mean, that's essentially what happened in Iceland in 1884. And yeah, it only took 60 years thereafter to get independence. Yeah, there's one at the back.
I don't think we'll be here, Peter.
No. I'll do one then.
I just wondered, if you were doing it all over again, what would you do differently?
Work faster. Be more aggressive against those who were kind of naysayers against the process. And be more, well, be less naive as to the ability of those who really don't want things to change to destroy everything for everybody else. I think that's the main thing. But I'd also like to actually make it into the Constitutional Council next time. No, I'm not very good at being a politician, but I'm fairly functional at being a geek, and the saying is everybody needs a hacker, right? But there is some, you know, I think it's kind of a part of the legacy of the United States that, you know, they venerate their founding fathers so highly that, you know, kind of being the guy who writes the Constitution is something everybody should really want to be in their country, right? So I'm not without ambition.
The American Constitution was written by quite a few Scots, I should tell you.
Yeah. It's good. All right. If there's any other questions, feel free to grab me either here or I'm going to be downstairs at the Bella Caledonia launch. So thank you very much for listening.